the first thing that I want to say about this topic is that it's quite a complicated topic and not easy to talk about. So we will do our very best today, and I have quite a long list of resources if you are interested in learning more. This is a very surface level introduction to Afro Indigeneity and sort of the ways that Black history and Native American history in North America intersect over the course of their shared histories. So I guess we'll get started.
Eleanor, can we do some introductions of yourself, myself, and Jordan?
Yes, so here is my introduction slide. And do you guys want to introduce yourselves first?
Yes, I can introduce myself. My name is Sunshine Thomas Bear, and I am the Thippo and Cultural Preservation Director for the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, and also, also the Angel de Cora Museum Director. Jordan?
Sometimes I can't get to that mute button. My name is Jordan Blackfish. I work here at the Angel de Cora Museum. I'm Sunshine's assistant here in the Winnebago Tribe. I'm also a member of the Asante Sioux Tribe, and and I was just glad to be able to help with Sunshine and Ben and Eleanor. So when she first kind of brought this to the table, I was like, oh, okay. So I'm interested to see the slides and learn more.
Thanks, Sunshine and Jordan. My name is Eleanor Brassfield. I'm the Community Education Coordinator here at Little Priest Tribal College. And I like to work closely with the Angel de Cora Museum on most of my cultural presentations because they are far more expert in particularly Ho-Chunk, about all Native American cultural topics than I am. I am a white woman. I did not grow up in Indian country. And so I always have to start with that. I do not hold either Native American or African American identities. And so I am hyper aware that this topic is both challenging and it's not it is not my, in a lot of ways, it's not my story to tell. So I'm not trying to tell anyone about how it affects me directly, if that makes sense. This is a, like I said in the email and in the Facebook post, this is a bird's eye view of the history, and I'm using resources that I have found to talk about the information that and to talk about the information that I have read in those resources. And at the end of this presentation, I'll be sharing a lot of resources that you can read to learn more for yourself. None of us are experts on this particular topic. We are learners. We're trying to start this conversation here in Winnebago. It's not a conversation that is commonly had, at least in our spaces. So we are starting to address these things, and we are starting to learn. And so if there are any like factual inaccuracies or any problems with the presentation or anything that we say that is wrong or that is not said well, please let us know, because we're here to learn as much as we're here to share what we have learned already. I do want to add a content warning. about historical trauma. There's a lot of trauma in this history, and there is a lot of just sadness and a lot of bad things have happened on this continent over the last 500 years. And so we don't want to diminish any of those things or their effects that lead up to today. Sunshine, do you have anything else that you want to add there?
Yes, I was just going to add that, you know, things are complicated in a sense, and also definitely not addressed. And the historical trauma, you know, that leads us to where we are today, you know. I have Afro Indigenous family members, you know, in Minneapolis and other places. So they, in talking with them and getting prepared for this presentation, you know, they struggle with their identities. And when they come home, you know, they're not looked at by some as, you know, being Ho-Chunk. But what we really wanted to emphasize with this presentation is that, you know, this racism that we have, you know, towards colors of skin, you know, whether it be too dark or too light or, you know, whatever, that was all stuff that has been picked up after being, you know, the colonizer and first contact and, you know, those types of things. And then we get into slavery and different types of things, you know, where we are looking down not only on ourselves, but, you know, others for the color of their skin and how they look, which is not a trait that is how we used to be. For tribes, you know, you either were or you weren't a part of the tribe. It didn't matter, you know, the color of your skin or what your hair looked like, which is what we decided in, you know, preparing for this presentation, you know, what we wanted to get across to our people, you know, that they are accepted and, you know, maybe not by everybody, but we are trying to break those barriers and talk about these things, because I don't think we can truly heal from things unless we talk about them. So we need to discuss, you know, and get it through our heads, you know, what we picked up from the colonizer, you know, racism, you know, lateral oppression, you know, lateral bullying, those types of things, you know, where we are holding ourselves down. So we, in healing from that, you know, we need to hold ourselves accountable, you know, and realize, you know, what we need to stop doing, these negative things that we've picked up from being colonized, and especially racism, you know, and we definitely don't need to be racist towards each other, you know, based on the color of our skin. So I'm just hoping that this is just a start. You know, maybe next year we can do something bigger, but just starting the road to healing for our people.
Thanks, Sunshine. All right, so we're gonna kind of go chronologically through time here, starting with the early post-contact years. So when we say post-contact, that means when Europeans arrived and the beginning of the colonial period in this continent. And so we'll go from there to talking about the complexities of slavery. Again, these are big topics. We're not going to go very deep into them. We're going to review sort of parallel and intersecting struggles that Native Americans and Black Americans and people who have, and Afro Indigenous folks have, that they share. And then we're also going to discuss some modern issues that from a couple different directions. So, and then I forgot to mention, the picture on the first slide is of Diana Fletcher. She's a Black Seminole who was adopted into the Kiowa tribe. And then on this slide is Carrie Elk on the left here. She's a Ho-Chunk woman. They're both Ho-Chunk women, but Carrie Elk is named, and they're the other person is an unidentified woman. So I don't have a name for her. But these pictures were probably taken either the very tail end of the 1800s or the beginning of the 1900s. So here is the early post-contact years kind of start after 1500. So if you think of that whole, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, there were a couple ships that came in that decade between 1492 and the beginning of the 1500s, but they were mostly Europeans on those ships. The first documented interaction where a group of enslaved Africans escaped inland or on Hispaniola, which is in the Caribbean, and they joined with some of the native tribes that lived there. But the first interactions between Africans and Native Americans on sort of the mainland soil was later into the early 1500s, mostly where the Spanish were entering and colonizing. So further south in the southwestern part of what is now the United States and Mexico and the islands. And then further north in what is now Canada, that is where the French, it was called New France, and that was the French colonies. And then also on the eastern seaboard, where the English were colonizing, and they also brought enslaved Africans with them. The French actually did not bring as many African slaves. All three of those groups brought did enslave Africans, but they also early on were enslaving Native people that they encountered here. So there was from the very beginning a common struggle between both who would become African Americans, enslaved Africans, and Native Americans, because they were all being oppressed by the European colonizers. Also early on, this part of what's now the United States down here, it is what is now Florida. The Spanish claimed for themselves, but they wanted it to be more like a no man's land. So there were a lot of actually, obviously there were a lot of Native Americans there, but there were also a lot of slaves who were able to escape their bondage from like Georgia and South Carolina and the colonies that were further south. If they were able to get to Florida, they were kind of free because they were able to, it was Spanish territory, but the Spanish were not very interested in spending time there. They mostly just wanted to have a buffer between themselves and the English, sort of as a political motivator. So that's where there's a group of what they call the Black Seminoles, like the image that I showed on the first slide. She was a Black Seminole, and that is where Black Seminoles come from. And then in the Southwest, something that I thought was interesting when I was reading for this was that probably the first contact between the Pueblos and the Spanish was with a man named Esteban de Dorantes, who was actually an enslaved Moroccan man who was on the expedition with and probably arrived before the Spanish members of his expedition when that first contact happened with the Pueblos in the Southwest. So this is mostly to say that from the very beginning there are these interactions that are happening, and then not also like in the 18th century, so before the Revolutionary War happened, there were laws passed in certain of the colonies to prevent settlers from bringing their Black slaves into what they called the frontier towards further west, because they knew and they were afraid that their slaves would run away and would be adopted or allowed to live free among the tribes that lived there. And they were also afraid that they would work together. The enslaved folks and the Native American tribes, they were afraid, the white settlers were afraid that they would work together to revolt against them.
Which is, I think, a lot where we get that instilled racism toward each race, for African Americans and our indigenous tribes in this country, that, we were from the get-go, being taught to hate each other, and really, tribes would take people in, that's where we get the African indigenous side of certain families and such. So what best way or tool of the colonizer is to make this rift, which didn't just happen between African Americans and indigenous people, but indigenous people against indigenous people. There were these fights and these things that were put into our heads, by the colonizer to get us against each other, because if we all banded together against them, maybe America would look really different right now.
Probably true. One thing that I saw was another thing that I thought was interesting as I was doing this research is oftentimes when lots of times they're called like massacres or attacks or one of these words on like colonial settlements, but I feel like it's just protecting against invaders. So it just depends what perspective you're taking. But when tribes would attack, like there was an attack on Jamestown early on, and they killed the white settlers, but they brought the Black slaves back with them to their lands. And then in 1753, there was a war called Pontiac's War in Michigan, near Detroit, so I'm assuming Michigan. And a resident had noticed that Native Americans were killing whites but saving the Blacks, and that resident feared that those actions would inspire an uprising. So kind of along those lines, I think it's it's always true that the oppressor wants to, just as a tactic of control, to separate the people that they're trying to oppress. All right, let's move on to the complexities of slavery. So there, from the beginning, the Europeans enslaved both Native Americans and Africans, and for the most part, there was a transition in the relatively early on away from enslaving Indigenous folks, so that, again, sort of a way to isolate different groups. Like the slaves were the African Americans, and then there were different, I shouldn't say African Americans because at this time it wasn't America, but there were just different compartments that different types of people were put in, and the roles that they could have in society, or that they had to have they were forced to have in society. But from the very beginning as well, there were independent freedmen settlements, like I'd mentioned in what's now Florida, where escaped slaves set up their own villages, their own towns. Sometimes they were welcomed into tribes, sometimes they just cohabitated on the same land, and so that those beginnings are really, again, when we talk about Afro indigeneity, that's the beginning of when either enslaved or formerly enslaved people would meet and fall in love with people who were Indigenous. And that was another one of those fears early on, is that they didn't want people mixing like that. And then and there was an Iroquois chief whose name I will probably not pronounce correctly, but his English name was Joseph Brant. He was Chief Thayendanegea. I'm sorry, I'm bad at Iroquois pronunciations. But he welcomed runaway slaves and encouraged intermarriage in his tribe, and was kind of made them a place on the Underground Railroad to freedom, in that antebellum pre-Civil War period. And so all of those things were, those are sort of positive relationships between Native Americans and enslaved Africans and freedmen. But unfortunately, there was also the darker side, in which some Native American tribes did also participate in the enslavement of African Americans, and the main tribes to do this are what were called the 5 civilized tribes, but their role, they were doing their best to assimilate into the European cultural standards that were required of them, because they did not want to be forced out of their homelands. So you have to remember that there's a lot of layers going on here, and so a lot of people who are Afro Indigenous are also descendants of these people who were enslaved by Native Americans, of a few different tribes. I don't think it was limited to those 5 tribes, but but those are the main ones that are commented on in the research and in the history. I don't know. It looks like Sunshine just stepped out, but I don't know if Jordan, do you want to say anything to this?
Oh no, I'm just listening, Eleanor.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I would want to emphasize with that is that, so, you know, the 5 civilized tribes that Eleanor was just talking about, you know, those tribes were trying really hard to keep their land. They thought if they fit in, you know, had courts that ran just like how they ran their courts, you know, and did things the way that the colonizers did then, you know, and they would be able to keep their land, keep their tribes intact, you know. And then this is the main tribes that you hear of, you know, when you hear of the name escapes me, the Trail of Tears. So, and then, you know, you get into that history of, you know, where they moved along the Trail of Tears. And then these tribes also took, you know, they're enslaved with them, you know, and which brings into a whole other, you know, issue that they're having now. But we won't get into that. But, you know, these tribes were trying their best to look after their people, you know, and what best way, you know, they could have thought of, you know, to keep their people home in their homelands, you know, but to begin to act like, you know, the Europeans around them, you know, and having slaves and, you know, I forget his name, but I think you guys get what I'm talking about, you know, the trying their best to keep their people where they are, but eventually, you know, like all tribes, you know, they had to end up moving anyway, you know, so there were these different taking over of land and making our indigenous people and tribes move, even when they didn't want to, you know, and this tribe in particular, you know, tried their best and eventually had to move as well. So then you get that tribe, you know, in the Oklahoma area now.
And we'll kind of touch on that a little bit in the modern issues slide, which is coming up in a couple more slides. But
well, there's one thing I would say, you know, this history, I didn't actually even learn about until last year in spring when I took Native American history with Cassie Kitchian. And I feel like I've heard it I've seen a few times, you know, somebody maybe post something, and I feel like the one thing I will say that kind of come from that too is that then other people link all tribes to this where it wasn't, you know. So that was one thing I did want to add, because it is not that happens too, is where it's like, you know, the Trail of Tears becomes all tribes, and we all had our different stories, but you know, we wasn't like, it becomes yeah, we're synced together basically, where this was happening on a totally different side of the world, you know.
Yes, and I think that that's important to clarify, Jordan, that these what they call the five civilized tribes, it's the Cherokee, the Creek, which are the main ones that I've looked at about for this topic, but there's 3 other ones, and that's why I didn't mention them earlier, because I don't remember what all 5 of them are off the top of my head. But they were all East Coast tribes as well. So again, this is a large continent. There's a lot of tribes. There are a lot of different cultures embodied here. And so I do want to make sure that while we are generalizing like enslaved Africans and we're generalizing Native Americans to a point in this, there is a wide diversity in how there were people enslaved from many parts of Africa, and there are tribes all over this continent that to this day have very, very different cultural backgrounds and focuses.
And then I just wanted to jump in. The 5 civilized tribes are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes.
Thank you. So on to parallel and intersecting struggles for equality. As I mentioned on the previous a couple times now, and I don't want to talk about it too much more, but there is this parallel because the English, French, and Spanish colonizers enslaved both Native Americans and Africans, and so there is that shared struggle from early on, and just sort of the colonial experience, right? The stealing of land, the stealing of people, the killing of people in order to exert power, is something that was done by the English, the French, and the Spanish, and they did this on what's now North American soil. So there are also sort of historically, and even to the present, similar struggles for legal definition of personhood even. For Native Americans, it wasn't until Chief Standing Bear, who was Ponca, his trial in 1879 is when non-citizen Indians were defined as persons in terms of federal law in the United States. And in our Constitution in the United States, which was, passed in 1787, there was the 3/5 compromise, which said that 3/5 of the slave population would be counted for determining direct taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. So an enslaved person was only considered 3/5 of a person. So we have these questions early on and for a long time about just what, like, defining people as people, which I think is still evident today in some of the policies that we see and some of the ways that we kind of think about different groups of people in the United States. But it wasn't until after slavery ended that the Black people were even considered people in the United States either. So it was very similar timing for both non-citizen Indians and Black folks just even being defined as an actual person in American legal code. They've had similar struggles for voting rights. It took longer for Native Americans to get voting rights in some sense. Kind of depends where you are and who you were. But with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were passed after the Civil War that ended slavery and opened up voting rights, that gave Black folks the right to vote. But then in many places, as many of you I'm sure know, those voting rights were taken away through other legal means up until the 1960s for African Americans. And that's a big part of what the American Indian movement was about too, kind of throughout the course of the 20th century, fighting for those basic voting rights so that both Native Americans and African Americans could have a voice in our society. And then segregation. I have a lot to learn when it comes to segregation regarding specifically Native Americans. It didn't work exactly the same as like the Jim Crow South did for Black Americans. but there was some housing segregation. And a big piece that actually Ben had mentioned that I think is really important to add is the lost genealogy, because when you are torn from your family, torn from your home, when you're treated as less than a human, you lose track of what you can easily lose track of where you came from and who your people are, and that is very important for both of these groups that we're talking about, and the people who have both of those identities. Like if you are a descendant of someone, if you're a descendant of someone who was Black, who was moved along the Trail of Tears, and you have both Black and Native ancestry, but you don't have access to really either of those genealogies, then that affects what you know about your own past and your own identity as well. So here are some modern issues that I kind of wanted to bring up, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that ancestry piece on this slide as well. So we have the title of this slide is Recognizing Afro Indigeneity, and I want to talk a little bit about the conflict between Black identity and Indigenous identity, and how people define themselves and how people are defined by others. A big part of this, probably the biggest part of this, is that blood quantum piece, where there is, and you know, historically in the United States, they always said if you had a drop of African, and if you had a drop of blood that came from Africa, if you had anyone in your entire background who was of African descent or from Africa, then you were considered Black. You were considered African American, just by the like segregation standards of the American South, and that sort of has affected everything else as well. So lots of times people who are Afro Indigenous are recognized as Black, and they're not recognized as Native, even though they do hold both of those backgrounds. On top of that, a lot of tribes rely on the Dawes rolls from the 19th century to define who has a right to be a member of their tribe, and so oftentimes those people with African ancestry were not added to the Dawes rolls, and that is an ongoing conversation that is being had as well. So there are issues with, on top of that, there are issues of blood quantum, which, as you may know, there are many tribes decide if people can be enrolled based on the percentage of Indian blood, and specifically Indian blood from that tribe that they have. And so, and oftentimes that percentage of Indian blood is linked back to the Dawes rolls. So if you are descended from people who were moved, say, with the Trail of Tears, and but your ancestor either was put on the Dawes rolls, but then you don't have a high enough percentage of Indian blood to count by blood quantum, or maybe your ancestor was not put on the the roles because they had African ancestry or for any other reason, then there are a lot of people who are excluded from tribal citizenship due to these backgrounds. And so I don't know if any, Jordan, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Other than, I've had people reach out to me before about how, kind of like just what you were saying, and makes it really difficult because it's almost like you're trying to prove to a group of people who, the government that, what this is, it's like this backwards, like, I don't know how to explain it, but that's all I was going to add into there. But one time I had somebody mention to me also that they went to ancestry.com and they took one of those tests or whatever, and some of it come back less than what they was thinking. And I also want to, in that regards, that some of those tests are only going based off of markers. So they're not always accurate. So it's like another way of just like, I feel like complicating for someone who's knows through oral history and knows from their family, but then when they go to, like you said, try to prove that, their information is just not there. It makes it really difficult. And then you feel, I mean, I can't speak for anybody because I don't know how they feel, but I know just from speaking with friends and stuff, they kind of, it's hard.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I know, like, specifically the Cherokee, I have a couple on my resources page, it's here. I have a couple articles for the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee, how they are starting to wrestle internally. Because there's been a movement in especially the past few years of Afro Indigenous folks who have been denied tribal enrollment for various reasons. Some of them were on the rolls and then they were removed from the rolls and things like that. It's like, I don't know enough to get into any kind of weeds on that right now, but there's been a lot of work done in the past few years trying to get recognized by certain tribes, especially. Like, the articles that I will link are specifically Cherokee and Creek.
And I bet Ben could kind of comment on this. We have here at the Angel Cora Museum, we've had people call, trying to just track back, on their family tree and the information that we have here, anything that's archived.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, I don't know, maybe he could talk a little bit about that, but I think that's why I love working here at the museum too, because we have that information that, you might not be able to find
and I think,
whatever.
Oops.
Oh, go ahead, Sunshine.
I think that, when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, of these things that hold our people back, and blood quantum is one of them, so it's important for us to, as tribes, to come together, to come to some consensus, to recognize, that these issues these things that we use on each other, like blood quantum, were, given to us by the colonizer, that frame of thought, and like I said earlier, before, when we were tribal members, before colonization and first contact, you either were or you weren't, a member of a tribe. It wasn't based on the color of your skin, like you were too light or you were too dark, or the color of your hair, those types of things, so these are really issues and things that we use against ourselves, to oppress ourselves, based on, what the government has given us to work with, but as tribes, and sovereign nations, we can totally come together to break those things that hold us back. You know, I know we have a lot of tribal members in probably all tribes that, you know, are wanting to be recognized and be a part of the tribe, but because of blood quantum and those types of things, we're unable to do that, you know, and those cause identity issues as well, you know, and we don't want that. We want our people to come together, you know, and be unified and help each other. And that's what we used to do, you know, and what we were known for, and being kind and welcoming and taking people in. But now it's like we're using the tools that the government used to break us down. We're using that against each other, you know, so then that's where the lateral oppression comes in, you know, and we got this historical trauma. So there's so many things that go into this type of topic, you know, it's not just one issue that's holding us back. It's so many different issues. But overall, you know, it would be historical trauma and the trauma that we continue to inflict on ourselves as tribes.
Yeah. And I'd like to add to that, that I'm in a historical trauma class right now, also with Cassie. And we were just talking about parenting yesterday and trying to break cycles. And I said it yesterday, and I think it applies here. You only know what you know, right? So like if you are raised in a sort of colonized mindset, then you have to like struggle to get out of that. And so I think it's important to stay here that that it's not about assigning blame or shame to anyone. It's about like figuring out what has been done wrong and ways to move on and ways to make things better than they have been. So I think that that's an important thing to highlight, as well as that the historical trauma is no one person's fault, really, especially in 2021. Like, we can't be blamed for the sins of our ancestors. All we can do is work to make things better. Okay. So here we are on a sort of happier note, I think. I like to think of it as happier. And these are shared fights for justice. So Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation activism. This is kind of the sweet spot where a lot of Afro Indigenous folks are working in advocacy and activism. But there's also some very robust crossovers and just issues that are of serious note to Indigenous people and Black folks and Afro Indigenous folks. There's the environmental and climate justice movement with water protectors, especially after what happened in Flint, Michigan. With the pipeline protests, there's been a lot of cross collaboration between different Indigenous rights groups and Black activist groups to fight for environmental justice and for climate justice, because they're the people who are most affected by these problems. There's also issues with voting rights and gerrymandering, even just this year. Maybe not this year, it's pretty early in the year, but I think I've heard about gerrymandering already this year, with identification requirements going to vote, with address requirements, and how I think it was the 2020 election, a lot of people struggled with voting because they had their addresses were PO boxes, and some places were saying that you couldn't vote if your address was a PO box. So there's a lot going with voting rights, and there's a lot of work that is being done to fight for these basic rights everyone who lives here should have as citizens. There's also foster care and adoption they affect Native Americans and African Americans more than any other group in the United States. And so that is a place, I don't know much about what kinds of collaborations may be happening already on those issues, but I think certainly if it's not already happening, that's a place where there should be a shared fight, because it's in everyone's best interest to keep to fight to keep families together. And then with Black Lives Matter, especially since the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020, there has been a lot of Indigenous allyship with that movement in the United States. And I think there are some really vocal people who are embracing their Afro-Indigeneity, and they are doing, they're fighting for themselves and their people. And it's very inspiring to me. So I don't know if Jordan or Sunshine, you wanted to add anything to that.
I would say, you know, they are, especially with the, you know, the Black Lives Movement, trying to band together. And I think that's really what we need. And we also need to work on, you know, ourselves as well, you know, because change, you know, will come from all of us together, but also, you know, the way that we think, you know, and letting go of some of those colonistic views that we hold, you know, and the racism, you know, and it's a touchy subject. That was one thing when going into this, you know, because this is our first discussion like this here. And, you know, we definitely did not want to, you know, make anyone feel singled out, you know, or make it seem like that's what we see in people, you know, the black and white, or you either are this or you're that, you know, because to us, you know, all of our Afro Indigenous tribal members, you know, are Ho-Chunk. It doesn't matter, you know, what they look like. And change is going to come from us and from within, and also a change in our mindset for each other, you know, and looking at the bigger picture is we want to be united as a people, you know, because things like blood quantum and those types of things are only going to harm our people and our tribe, because one day if we continue to use blood quantum, you know, in a few 2 or 3 generations, you know, our numbers are going to drop dramatically. So letting go of those types of things and becoming educated about them, you know, and how they were set up to do their job. You know, they were extremely successful in what they did when they came up with the idea of blood quantum. And, you know, you get into other things like the Allotment Act and those types of things. And those were all set up to ensure that one day we would be extinct. And if we continue to use those tools against ourselves, you know, we will no longer be tribes, because eventually our blood and our land will be, you know, too broken down for us to meet our own standards, you know, of 1/4 or whatever. So just those types of things I wanted to add in there before we get off today.
I kind of, same thing, Sunshine, and we've had this conversation before just between me and you, and, you know, I always fear for my kids and my grandkids' future, because my kids are enrolled, but, you know, for their kids, is that going to be the same? And it's just it's a very touchy subject, and I'm not trying to just be quiet over here. I'm actually listening. Some of these things are new to me as well. And, you know, some of the things that you had talked about with some of the activism have really brought a closer view, because some of these things I'd never even heard of until I took Native American history, because it's not really taught, it's not really talked about. And, you know, like even coming into this, you know, I'm very like, you know, like I don't want to say, it's like a very touchy subject. So I feel like, but I like what Sunshine had to say, and I just kind of piggyback off that because that's something that I'm dealing with now. As for, you know, for my daughter, you know, she was a drop away from being enrolled, my oldest, and I just thought that was so crazy to think, you know. So what do I tell her now? Like, oh well, sorry, you're white, you know, like what? It's just like a weird thing. And then for her to grow up with us and her family, and then, you know, us telling her, no, you're Ho-Chunk, or no, you're Dakota, you know, this is the way you're growing up. But then on the other spectrum, you see this blood quantum and is telling you, no, you're not enough. You're not enough. So, you know, I don't know, like I said, I can't speak for everybody and I don't know what everybody is dealing with, but these are the things that I'm dealing with. And I think that, you know, hearing you share some of the information is just, I'm able to not totally relate, but relate on a different level, I guess. And so like I said, I'm not just trying to keep quiet, I'm actually listening and kind of learning a little bit different things.
Thanks, Jordan. Jamie, I see your hand. What's your question or comment?
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. As someone who is excluded from the tribe because of blood quantum, I can totally relate. And I ugly cried to Sunshine because I was just up in my feelings one day, and I just ugly cried to her about how badly it hurt to be excluded from things that happen in Winnebago, and you know how I get looked at differently. So I can totally relate to the struggles and stigma around blood quantum. And then also I'd like to point out that my mom always taught me to look for the similarities and not the differences between myself and other folks. And there's a lot of parallels between Black folks and Indigenous folks. You know, we're all POC, and Black folks were captured and enslaved and brought over here. And around the same time that AIM was coming up, the Black Panthers were coming up, and those two groups started because they were trying to protect their communities, and they were going around and feeding the children and creating activities and trying to be community minded and build up their communities. And they were eventually vilified by the FBI and the government because they were trying to move their communities forward. So a lot of times when you see something like Black Lives Matter, you'll see AIM flags showing up, or when there's Indigenous activism going on, you'll see Black Lives Matter or Black Panthers showing up for us. So we do really help each other out, and we do see those parallels between each other. And the other thing that I would like to point out with blood quantum is that for Afro Indigenous folks, being Black is a inclusionary method, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, Indigenous people have to deal with an exclusionary way of being counted. So they wanted more Black folks around to be slaves. So if you had one drop of African blood in you, you were considered Black. And if you do not have enough Indigenous blood in you, then you don't count towards your tribe. So it's two very opposite sides of the spectrum, and that's to keep us under control and to either wipe out Indigenous folks or create more workers with Black folks. So yeah, that's all I got to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, thanks to Jamie. I did kind of mention the one drop and the blood quantum, but I think she said it a lot better than I did. With both of these things are means of control over both Native Americans and Black folks, and both are meant to the blood quantum was originally introduced as a point of genocide to completely eliminate Native Americans over a couple generations, kind of like just like what Sunshine said and what Jordan was talking about and what Jamie was talking about here. So and on the other side, like the one drop rule for African Americans was developed during segregation in like the slavery and post-slavery eras, when if you had any Black blood whatsoever, you were at least a second or third class citizen, and didn't have access to the same things that people who were identified as white did have access to. So in closing for this presentation, again, things are complicated. I've really tried hard to put things together in a way that wouldn't offend anyone. The issues are issues that affect all of us across the board. Honestly, regardless of race, like I don't remember who said it, but someone said, I cannot be free until everyone is free. And that is something that I believe. And so it's going to continue to be complicated. Hey, I'm the whitest of white people. I have struggled with white guilt for a lot of my life. And I think that is something that I'm better with now than I have been in the past, but I am super aware that it was my relatives who came to this land and have caused a lot of the things that have been done here. And so all we can do in our generation is work to make things better.
One thing I want to say, Eleanor, is I was watching this interview one time, and this lady had talked about how when a lot of like the George Floyd, a lot of the activism was going around during that time, how it seemed like a lot of people were jumping up and were ready there to also support and whatnot, but it kind of just ended at like sharing information on Facebook, or maybe just like talking about it a little bit, and that's it, you know? And so I feel like when I know that is probably uncomfortable at, you know, when we had talked about how you had just stated in the beginning of this whole thing about how, you know, you're coming from a good place, and this isn't like you're trying to say how somebody's supposed to feel or how people feel. So I feel like you did a really good job at just getting the information out there, but you also didn't just stop at making a post about it. You didn't stop at just sharing a little bit at it. You know, like sharing your resources and stuff like that. That's taking that step further. And, you know, I just really appreciate that. So that's all I wanted to say.
And this is Sunshine. And yes, I wanted to thank Eleanor and Ben and Jordan for diving into this issue with me. You know, it was, you know, a collaborative effort. And I just really feel like it's a discussion that we needed to have probably a long time ago. But, you know, we're trying now, and we do understand, you know, that we've missed a lot, you know, and we didn't say, talk about a lot, you know, we only have a little bit of time. We're actually way over time. But so I just wanted to, you know, thank you all. I know it's a touchy subject, you know, we didn't want to hurt nobody's feelings. We don't want you to think that that's how we see things or see our tribal members, you know, by color. But we want to know that we also recognize you and the struggles that we all have. You know, we all are struggling with something, you know, with our identity because of colonization or blood quantum or those types of things. So many issues that we have for our people, but we just wanted to start the discussion. And, you know, of course, you know, email any one of us, you know, if you have something to add, you know, for next year or whatever we need to do to help, you know, help heal and help you see your identity and see who you are. And you are, you know, our tribal members, our people, our family, our relatives, and Ho Chunk or whatever tribe you are part of, you know, and it isn't, you know, based on blood quantum or anything. It's what's in your heart, you know. So just thank you everyone for joining, and thank you Eleanor, Ben, and Jordan for all your hard work with this.
I have one last thing. I know that the museum is always working on collecting stories from people, and I think that this is going to be one of the focuses that they're taking. So if you or anyone in your family or any of your friends have these identities, are Afro Indigenous, or you know, anywhere in your networks, I know that they are in the process of collecting interviews and collecting people's stories. So if you could reach out to them, that would be great. You can reach out to me, and I can connect you with them. I have my email on the last slide here. So please share your stories. We're not the experts. We're trying to learn, and we can only learn if people are willing to teach. So that's where we are with that.
And then just one last thing. This is Sunshine, and we are doing a photo shoot tomorrow for our Afro Indigenous tribal members. I know that a lot of, you know, probably not in the area, but if you know anybody that would be interested or share stories regarding this topic, because it is Black History Month, is why we are doing this. So yeah, just reach out to us, and maybe Eleanor, you can throw our contact information in there, or email the Angel Decora Museum at winnebagotribe.com. Thank you guys.
Thanks everyone. I will be posting this. I have 3 pages of resources here. Not all of which have I read, but I really want to thank you all. I will share all of those links to all of those resources. I'm going to reach out to Trip at the library here to see if we can get some of the books that I have listed on my books page in the library, because like I said, I think it's important that we have access to and share these stories. So thank you for your intention. If you are interested, you can email me at communityed@littlepriest.edu, or you can email the Angel Decora Museum. They come right up if you Google them. And I want to just thank you all for coming here today. I really appreciate you all.